Hey guys, it's me Astrid, and today I want to tell you about how to take care of that one Phalaenopsis orchid that your friend gave you or you bought on a whim and you have no stinking clue what to even do with this plant now that you have it. Right? Is that how you're feeling? Or you got this plant and you basically almost killed it and you're wondering, well, what do I do now? So, let's talk about orchids. First off, this is a Phalaenopsis orchid. It's also called a moth orchid because the flowers resemble moths if you stretch your imagination a little bit. These orchids are epiphytes. What that means is that they grow on trees in nature. They wrap their roots around a branch and they grow often sideways or hanging down. So, what does this mean? Well, first thing, these roots are green. They contain chlorophyll, which means they're capable of photosynthesis, just like the leaves. So these roots not only pull up water and moisture, they also can undergo photosynthesis and produce energy for the plant. Now, what does all this mean? Well, first thing, because these plants are epiphytic, that means that they have very airy roots. They don't like to have this dirt-covered, unbreathing, very tight roots. They don't like that at all. The roots will die if they're too soggy and wet all the time because in nature they don't grow that way. Additionally, we like to use clear pots because these roots can undergo photosynthesis, and an added bonus is that when you use a clear pot, you can look closely and see what is going on with the roots. Is there mold? Is there algae? Are the roots healthy and green? Are they dying? When the roots are green, like here, that means that the plant has enough moisture and doesn't need any more water. You can see this bark is darkly colored, and that means that I recently watered this orchid. You can see that these roots are more silvery, and when you see this silvery appearance, not brown, that's an unhealthy root, but the silvery appearance, that means that the plant is ready to have a little bit more water. Alright, so now that we understand that orchids are epiphytic, that their roots undergo photosynthesis, that they need air to their roots rather than to be suffocated, how do we proceed? Now, you may have a new orchid that's still in good shape, or you may have kind of already partially killed the orchid that you have. The way we can tell oftentimes if orchids are getting unhealthy is by the leaves. So you look at this leaf, and this leaf was this size when it was at the nursery, which means it was grown in ideal conditions. So this is a nice big leaf. This second leaf grew in smaller. That's not very normal. Leaves tend to grow in a little bit bigger than the last leaf, or at least the same size, meaning that the roots were probably getting in bad shape when this leaf was grown. Next we see this leaf. This leaf is even smaller. It's very tiny, which means that this plant was having basically no roots. And that was true. When I got this plant, this was the highest leaf. They grow they grow on opposite sides to each other, up from the center. And when I got this plant, it had this leaf growing, meaning it was in bad conditions. But I got it, and I put it in better conditions, which I'm about to explain to you. And the next leaf grew bigger, and the next leaf grew almost as long as the one that was under ideal settings, which is great. If we look at this orchid on the right, what can you tell me? Well, these leaves happen to grow small. It was bigger, it grew smaller, smaller. This leaf grew really big. And then I tried to repot it in an unfriendly potting situation that it did not like. The next leaf grew in very small. So, unfortunately for me, some of the roots did die on this orchid, and I had to move it back to a smaller pot. I'm sorry if you hear the smoke detector in the background. That's so annoying. So, what do we pot it in? Oh, good, that alarm went off. Now I can keep filming. Sorry for the interruption. So, what do we pot it in? Well, you can get even a plastic cup, a water bottle, a plastic soup container, but basically we want to get something clear plastic, and it doesn't have to be expensive or fancy or specifically designed for orchids at all. The first thing we do with this pot, we cut it to whatever you deem to be an appropriate height. I think this was a little bit tall. I might have cut it down here if I had more experience at the time, but that's okay. Now, we need to pot based on the size of the roots, not based on the size of the leaves. If the root system only expands about this big, you want to find something with about that diameter. Then we take it, if it's a water bottle, we cut the top off, and then we put lots and lots and lots of holes down the sides. You can see that on both of these, there's holes going all the way down, all around the plant, and that allows lots of fresh air to get in. Additionally, we want to put some drainage holes on the bottom because, as we learned, these types of orchids don't like standing water. So what that means is that you should have easy drainage at the bottom. If water pools on the bottom, oftentimes many roots that are down there can die. Okay, so now that we have our pot with holes drilled in it, which you can do with an actual drill, or I just screwed it in with a screwdriver, or you hold a lighter next to the plastic and melt it and jab a skewer in, which, proceed at your own risk because that's not necessarily completely safe, but I did it and it worked well. Once you have your pot situated, you have the right size for your roots, you have to look at, well, what do I put? Do I just put dirt in? No, because orchids are not terrestrial, meaning they don't grow in terra firma, they grow up in trees, they're epiphytic. So you can get this bark media, and it doesn't have to be, fancy bark, it just needs to be bark chips. This size is about as small as you want to go for Phalaenopsis orchids. I usually get a bit bigger bark mix, but this is what was available to me. Now you can get fancy with your mix. You can see this, I think, sponge rock in here, which allows more ventilation and more quick drainage than just bark chips, but I've grown in only bark chips and it works just fine for Phalaenopsis orchids. So we have our bark chips, and I also put rocks in the bottom of these pots because it weighs them down. Because when you water it, sometimes the bark floats up and it's very annoying to deal with because it just unsettles your new unstable plant that hasn't gotten an established root system, and it's frustrating. So the rocks help the bark to stay down. Now you may say, what is this stuff? This is called sphagnum moss. Oftentimes you may bring a Phalaenopsis orchid, especially mini Phalaenopsis orchids, home in a little tight plastic container like this big with the roots all along the sides and only sphagnum moss. The problem with sphagnum moss is that in your home environment it provides way too much moisture and almost no ventilation. So if you're using sphagnum moss, I would suggest not putting it in the bark mix because it might make it too moist. However, if you live in a hot, arid climate, that could be good for your plant, but I live in a temperate, damp climate, so no sphagnum in my mix. Again, you have to adjust everything a little bit based on your climate. So that's sphagnum moss. Usually we just use our bark mix. Now you may say, well, how do I water it? If I overwater it, I'll kill it. Well, yes, overwatering is one of the easiest and fastest ways to kill a Phalaenopsis orchid. Yes, that is what killed your roots. It was probably too much water. But overwatering and underwatering can have similar effects if your leaves begin to shrivel. The shriveling from overwatering comes from killing off all the roots, then the plant has no way to get moisture to the leaves, so they shrivel. Underwatering gives not enough moisture to lots of roots, and they also don't get enough moisture. So these symptoms can be mixed up, but typically overwatering will be your problem. So when we water, I water about once a week. Again, this depends on climate. If you live in a hot place like Arizona, you might want to water your orchids more often. For me, I live in Oregon. I water my Phalaenopsis orchids once a week, basically throughout the whole year. I get a pot that's about this big, and I fill it with water, and then I set this down into the water. You only want water to come up to here. You don't want it to touch the leaves of the plant because in nature, these hang sideways off of trees or upside down, and they don't have any system to deal with water that gets into the leaves. And what happens when water gets, especially in the center of the plant down here, you can get rotting that is so quick and so devastating that the plant can die overnight, and that's called crown rot. And that's really bad. If you get water down here when you're watering, it's best to take a paper towel, dab this off, and get it dry. Usually if you do that and have good air ventilation, it will be fine. But that's why we also water from the bottom up rather than the top down with Phalaenopsis orchids. So, what else? Also, when we're repotting, be sure to put the plant up higher. You don't actually want to put dirt up to here. You want to have it down here because this part of the plant doesn't like to be covered up at all. We put orchids in pots for our convenience, not for theirs. That's why we have to be careful with them. So we've covered what kind of pot, clear, well ventilated, snug for the roots. We've covered what kind of potting mix. Bark, typically. You can have fancier things if you like, but bark chips are just great for Phalaenopsis orchids. Watering, once a week from the bottom up. Fertilizers, I don't really care that much about them. They're not extremely important. You can read about it yourself if you're curious, but the old adage for orchid growers is weekly, which means you use a weak concentration of the fertilizer once a week. And that's great for most people, but you can be willy-nilly with fertilizers, and orchids are actually very tenacious, determined, surviving plants. They're really resilient. You can see this plant went through it. This plant had 3 roots left when I got it, and now it's grown these amazing green roots that wrap around the bottom of the plant, just because I put it in conditions that it liked to have for its growth. So even though these orchids were on the brink of dying, you can take them back and make them healthier, and I hope this video teaches you how. If you have some more questions, you would like more advice on orchids, I'm going to provide some links in the description. But otherwise, enjoy your beautiful plants. These are very satisfying, tenacious, and wonderful, wonderful, wonderful plants, and I really love them. And be careful. Once you get the orchid bug, you're going to fill your house up with orchids and you won't even know what happened. It happened to me, and I couldn't be happier. Thanks for watching this video. I hope I've helped you save some Phalaenopsis orchids. By the way, if a Phalaenopsis has no roots left at all, it's probably going to die, and it might be better to just buy a new one and try again. If it has at least 1 or 2 roots, you have a chance of saving it. That's my last advice. Thank you for watching. Good luck with your plants. Have a good evening.